Okay, so we're halfway done with the book. We looked at the next few chapters after the midway point. Odysseus has made his way home, and we've read and listened to hopefully books 13 to 16, which the deep dive here I'm calling Sleep, a Strange Murderer, and a Homecoming. 5 essential discussion questions about the Odyssey books 13 to 16. And I just want to say that more and more I go back and forth in my mind as a teacher and as someone who guides people through reading this book for the first time. How much information to give people? You know, how much do you tell them before they read? So obviously it's up to you. And I think what I'd like to do here isn't so much offer my particular analysis of the themes of these chapters and important moments, but to maybe raise some questions for discussion. If you're reading this with a reading group or a class, maybe these can be the grounding for a discussion. So my experiences early on, maybe for the first half of the entire epic, to really be deliberate and scaffold the reading and sort of give my students heads up about the key moments, have them annotate the book a little bit before they actually read and listen to the book. So they're sort of grounded in it and they can relax. But I think depending on who you're reading it with or your reading experience, you'll be able to gauge, how much of this guidance you need, frankly. So it's really a personal choice. These are just 5 particular questions that I'm wondering about after books 13 to 16. So the common complaint, we've just read books 9 to 12, probably the most famous chunk of the epic, and it's the most famous chunk perhaps because Odysseus is telling the story, so we have a hero's own version of the hero's story. And we have amazing tales, amazing adversaries, whirlpools and six-headed monsters and cyclopses and witches. It's hard to compete with that. So it looks like Odysseus makes his way home. In chapter 13 of a 24-chapter book, the goal is to go home. So it can feel like that the action isn't really that interesting in chapters 13 and 16, that we're in a bit of a waiting period. I don't know. I think it depends on how you define action, frankly. I think Odysseus is a different sort of hero than Achilles is. And I think we have to pay attention to Odysseus's mind, and Odysseus's stories, and Odysseus's improvisations, and Odysseus's lies. And I think those represent action for him as much as, fighting and monsters do. So here's my first question. Why do you think Odysseus is made to sleep for the rest of his journey home? He tells his story to the Phaeacians and they go home. And if you go to page 320 of your Emily Wilson translation, it's book 13, line 113. And here's the little paragraph. They rode inside the bay. They knew the place of old. Their arms were pulling at top speed. These are Odysseus's guys, right? The ship was traveling so fast that when she reached dry land, she beached for half her length. They disembarked and lifted from the ship Odysseus, wrapped up in sheets and blankets. They set him on the sand, still fast asleep. Doesn't it feel like he's a baby, right? Which is really interesting. He's sound asleep and he's all wrapped up in blankets. They unpacked all the presents he was given by the Phaeacian lords to take back home, thanks to Athena's care. They heaped the things beside the olive tree so no one passing would do them any damage while their owner was sleeping. Then they rode away back home. So this is with help from some of the Phaeacians, clearly. I think this is worth discussing. Odysseus has slept in a couple of different significant moments so far, and before things went badly when he fell asleep. Those men unleashed the bag of winds prematurely and they were brought off course. Here, he's sort of supernaturally made to sleep. And off the top of my head, the implication may be that Odysseus awake is very dangerous. But it's worth thinking about because they go from the island of the Phaeacians to Ithaca extremely quickly. This is an uneventful, no turbulence, no monsters, no cyclops, no witches trip. How much of that is, Athena and, the supernatural forces helping Odysseus are now finally ready to bring him back home? How much of it is, Homer constructing a story a certain way? And on a human level, how much of it is simply that Odysseus awake causes too much problems? He actually needs to be asleep in order for him to get back home. I don't know. It's worth thinking about. Second, what does Homer tell us by making half of the poem about a 10-year journey home, full of monsters, witches, and shipwrecks, while the other half of the poem takes place once he is already home? Really great stuff is written by Jonathan Shea about this, the psychologist I've mentioned before, who wrote Achilles in Vietnam, Achilles in Vietnam, and Odysseus in America. I think most of us have been away from home, say a longer vacation, and returning home requires some time to recalibrate being home. That vacation life in a hotel has a different cadence to it. You see different people, there's different patterns. And then home is just a different set of activities, and it takes a while to get used to it. And maybe at first we don't recognize it completely. It feels different than what we've recently experienced. I know, if we know people who've served in the military, that returning home, I mean, literally they recognize, the house. But it does beg the question, what does home mean to all of us that are reading this poem? We all have different experiences. We bring those to the reading experience. And that's one of the great things about teaching this book to a group of diverse folks. Home, I think, for most people is more than a place we sleep and eat. So is it a place where we associate memories with our family? Is it a place we've raised families? Is it a place we've, hung out with our brothers and sisters? Is it a place we've had birthday parties and holiday parties? What is it? And what do you think Homer might be telling us if this warrior returning home, half of that journey is about the actual trauma of the journey itself, and maybe the other half is about the trauma of being home itself? That maybe this person who's used to a decade of combat and a decade of monsters and witches, maybe the return home isn't easy. It's one thing to return home to where you live. It's another thing to be home, to feel home. It's a cliche reading of the poem to say that warriors returning home often take a while to acclimatize back to civilian life. I think this, all of us, though, whether we've served or not, I think that's a particular challenge, though, to return home after combat service. But I think it really is interesting that the most famous parts of this epic are the monsters and such, but half of the content of the epic is he's home the entire time. So I think it's worth discussing. If the goal of the poem is nostos, the journey home, if the goal of the poem is to return home, what does it say that happens halfway through the poem? It might be the case that the pitfalls of Circe and Scylla and Charybdis, while serious and fatal, are no more serious and fatal than the pitfalls of him returning home. And I know in this case it's the 108 or so suitors, but if you think of veterans who have trauma challenges, who fought, in combat, that home isn't a place of comfort and warmth and predictability necessarily, that if you're still in warrior mode, home is dangerous just in a different way. I don't know, maybe Homer knew something, but this is worth discussion. Third question. And I love that Homer, he could have brought Odysseus gradually home with long chapters about, Athena or flashbacks or whatever, but instead, Odysseus, in disguise as an old person, a beggar, spends a significant amount of time with the man, Eumaeus, who took care of Odysseus's pigs. and really like he's not a slave, but he's pretty low in the hierarchical ladder of Ithaca. And one could easily make the case that Eumaeus is the best Greek in the entire poem, or at least the best Greek in Ithaca at this point. So Odysseus in disguise as a poor beggar, and that's a separate conversation. Why doesn't Odysseus just launch in, right? Why doesn't he launch in? It might be the case, it might be practical, right? It might be practical in that if he goes in sort of guns blazing, or in his case, his sword and shield, there's over 100 men vying for the affections and the marriage of his wife, 100. And as great a warrior as Odysseus is, he's not Achilles, and maybe he has to use his cleverness and his ability to disguise himself in order to attain ultimate victory. But why is it important here that the swineherd is so virtuous? On the surface, it's obvious. Odysseus needs to be cared for. He needs someone to care for him. And that seems to be the swineherd. But if you go on page 334, which is book 14, line 53 of Emily Wilson's translation, Odysseus mentions that, Odysseus in disguise mentions that Eumaeus welcomes him so willingly. And then Eumaeus answers, "One must honor guests and foreigners and strangers, even those much poorer than oneself. Zeus watches over beggars and guests and strangers. What I have to give is small, but I will give it gladly." This, more than any other passage in either the Iliad or the Odyssey, illustrates what a good Greek was supposed to do in terms of xenia, in terms of hospitality. And, it sort of reminds me of, the woman washing Jesus's feet with her hair, and Jesus making the point that, like, this is all she has. So this is worth more coming from her than, a wealthy person dropping a few coins in my pocket. That's a gross paraphrase, but I don't know. There's interesting connections here. The ancient world just has a lot of strangers in it, as we'll see in the next slide. And sometimes strangers are murderers on the run. It's very dangerous, right, to be hospitable. It isn't like if there's a new neighbor, across the street from me in the suburbs, and I bring over meatballs and sausage to them and we have that's safe. This isn't what we're talking about. This is an entirely new person, and there's a risk involved in being hospitable and in exercising xenia. So it might be worth talking about that. Why is it important that the person who seems to be the best Greek in the town isn't who you'd expect? It might be a statement about how virtue isn't necessarily connected to your status, that whether you're a good person has nothing to do with your bank account or your rank. Or it might be just a reminder that, Odysseus's hometown is so desperate for virtue that the only person that shows virtue is the guy who takes care of the pigs, and none of the people you'd expect it from, like the suitors, have any. But I don't know, this is worth talking about. Somewhat connected to this. Why is it important? Number 4, why is it important that on his way home to Ithaca, this is in book 15, Telemachus agrees to help Theoclymenus, who is a prophet and a murderer on the run. So I just want to read this. It's book 15, and it's line 258. And it's interesting. Book 15 brings us back. We know that Telemachus, in the end of book 4, leaves Menelaus to return home. And we're kind of, on the edge of our seat waiting for him to meet his father again. Line 258. On the journey, on the way to the journey home, he comes across this person who wants help. It says it was his son named Theoclymenus who had approached Telemachus while he was pouring wine and praying to the gods. The stranger said, "My friend, I find you making sacrifices. I beg you by religion, by the gods, and by your life and your men's lives. Who are you? Who are your parents? What is your hometown?" These are all the most personal questions people could ask each other. And you're not supposed to ask them sort of as you meet them, but Theoclymenus can't afford to be polite. He's desperate for help. And curiously, Telemachus answers. Telemachus said, "Stranger, I will tell you, I come from Ithaca. my father is Odysseus. He was, right? And then he just kind of laments. He must have died some dreadful death by now. It was for him I got this ship and crew. I sailed to seek news of my absent father. And the stranger replied, here's an interesting little nugget. I am too far from home. I killed a man of my own tribe, and I have many brothers and kinsmen, powerful in Argos, so I'm on the run. They want to kill me. I've been doomed to homelessness. But please let me on board your ship. I come to you in desperation. Otherwise, I'll surely be killed. Those men are after me. So Telemachus is in that precarious position of, I know my job as a good Greek is to exercise Xenia and to be hospitable, but this guy comes right out and outs himself as a murderer. So this is one of those really interesting tensions, and it's really interesting. And if you're looking for a place where Telemachus is behaving like a man, not a boy, it's here. Telemachus said, yes, you can join us on board our ship, and what we have is yours. You are our guest. So Stephen Tracy, in his really, really great short little book called The Story of the Odyssey, he writes this, and I wrote this because I put this on the slide because it's so important. Murderers in the ancient world were considered polluted and were restricted on penalty of death from certain holy places on the grounds that they would contaminate them. This is the person Telemachus offers to help. So that's what the stakes are, and that's what the danger is. My question is, what's Homer telling us about the fact that Telemachus is making this choice right before he goes home, right before he meets his father? I just think that's pretty interesting. Okay, so my last question is in book 16, and it's simply, why is it interesting that Telemachus reacts to Odysseus's return the way he does? It might remind you of some other passage from book 9, from the Calypso chapter. So Athena changes Odysseus from a beggar who Telemachus had spent some time with as a beggar to himself. Now, it's not like Telemachus knows what Odysseus looks like. He doesn't have photos in his phone. There's no social media posts about Odysseus, and Odysseus left when Telemachus was a baby. So we get in line 181. Telemachus returns to Eumaeus' hut and sees this person who's very different. He says, stranger, you look so different from before. Your clothes, your skin. I think that you must be some god who has descended from the sky. Be kind to us, and we will sacrifice and give you golden treasure. Pity us. That's it. That makes sense. How else could someone change shape if he wasn't a god? That's what one of the things gods did. Long-suffering Odysseus replied, Odysseus tells his son, I'm no god. Why would you think such things? I'm your father, that same man you mourn. It is because of me these brutal men are hurting you so badly. Then he kissed his son and cried, tears pouring down his cheeks. He had been holding back till then. The boy did not yet trust it really was his father, and said, no, you're not Odysseus, my father. Some god must have cast a spell to cause me further pain. And later in the passage, right around line 207, Odysseus tells him again he's Odysseus, and then says, Athena did it. Athena made me change. And Telemachus then embraces him and realizes it's who it is. So here's the weird thing. If you remember when Calypso was told by Hermes, it's fated, Odysseus' time, Odysseus is going to leave Ogygia now. Calypso approaches Odysseus weeping on the beach. Do you remember Odysseus' reaction when Calypso says, I'll help you return home now? And Odysseus doesn't believe her. He thinks she's tricking him. And here Telemachus thinks that this person is not telling the truth. That's his first response. That's worth discussing. What sort of person doesn't believe that? What would that person have gone through in life to not believe good news habitually? So a couple of just little nuggets connected to this. The word nostalgia we have means usually yearning for the old days. My dad would always lament that the 1950s were over because he was nostalgic for those simpler times. Nostos is a really important word in the Odyssey, and it's a Greek word for a return home, especially by sea. And this crazy circuitous path here is actually Odysseus's journey. You can actually take Mediterranean cruises that sort of go through Odysseus's journey, and they're usually nice enough to not have cyclopses and six-headed monsters as a part of them. You want it to be realistic, but not that realistic. So, interestingly, throughout Odysseus's desire to return home, the word nostos is used throughout the poem. In Book 15, in the very early stages, the first few lines of Book 15, it's the first time it's also used for Telemachus, that he has a desire to return home. So that's like a linguistic example, a moment where Homer uses the same exact word, which seems to forge a connection between father and son. And that might be worth digging into. Why do that? What's being said by using the same word to talk about these two men coming home from, in a lot of ways, very different experiences. And then, if you want to impress people, right? You're at a school dance and you want to throw this out. And by the way, if you impress somebody at a school dance with a Greek literary term, you want to get that person's number. But the term is ananoresis, ananoresis, which is a fancy way of saying moment of recognition or discovery. A moment of recognition or discovery. A lot of great literary texts and films have an ananoresis. The most famous in film that I know, I grew up as a Star Wars fanatic, and near the end of Empire Strikes Back, after Luke and Darth Vader fight for quite some time with their lightsabers, Darth Vader says, "I am your father." Luke, that's not true. It's impossible. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. And Luke does. That's Luke's a key ananoresis. And the recognition scene in the Odyssey, while sadly doesn't involve lightsabers, is also complicated because realizing difficult truths is difficult. Realizing difficult truths about ourselves and our circumstances is hard, and we often don't embrace them immediately. But it's a really powerful emotional scene. I've had students in my classroom throughout the years who are adopted, who often will say, "Well, I've never met my birth father. I have loving parents. I don't really know if I'd like my birth. I don't know who that is." And that's just a really important thing for me to remember as a teacher, that this isn't simply a literary text that we can write papers about, but there's real human things happening here. And if you haven't seen a loved one in a really long time, this is 20 years. It looks like in the formula of the book, right? The goal is to return home and to connect with your family, and that's great, but there's no guarantee that's going to go well. So there's a certain complexity there to how that's all going to happen. And I think Homer, one of the reasons maybe that Homer takes his time having all these chapters before the entire story's climax is to make sure these characters are connected. And later on we'll get, Odysseus, we'll get Telemachus, also Penelope. They have to be connected. If there's going to be a big final battle, a big final conflict, the sides need to be connected to each other. And that's going to take time. If you hadn't talked to someone, an old friend, for a long, long time, it takes a while to reconnect and to figure out where you're at with your lives. And I think that's what needs to occur here. So I hope this helps you think a little more deeply about some key questions. I don't think I answered any of the questions super clearly, and that's hopefully okay. But these are some questions that you can write about, discuss with classmates or other teachers, and I hope this is helpful. Good luck.